Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this week's episode, we'll explore the story of the missing of the Great War. We'll examine exactly what the term means, what the experience was like for the loved ones of those amongst that number, and how the legacy of those individuals still shapes our understanding of the Great War to this day. Hello Dan, always a pleasure to be joining you on the podcast, and today we're going to be covering a slightly different subject to those that we've been examining so far in this series, because we're going to be looking specifically at the missing of the First World War. And I think when we think about the First World War, and particularly we think about the memorials of the First World War, something that's always going to spring to mind are memorials specifically to the missing, such as the Menin Gate at Ypres and Thiepval at the Somme. And perhaps more than any other war, and certainly in the West, I think this includes the Second World War, when we associate the idea of missing in action, it often centres on those men who are missing from the First World War. So it's a very powerful subject.
Yeah, hi Spence. It is a very powerful subject indeed. And you can understand, I think, to an extent, when we get into the numbers of just why the idea of somebody being missing is going to be such a prevalent one in the Great War. And we'll maybe try and unpick exactly why the missing in action rates are so high, particularly on the Western Front. So, loads to cover in this episode. And like you, as you were even just mentioning the word missing there when we're talking about the Western Front, the first things that spring to mind for me are going to be Thiepval and the Menin Gate. And for good reason. Those two memorials alone, and they're two amongst many, have 55 and 72,000 names on each. That is an incredible number. But in order to, I think, contextualize that to a certain extent, we need to understand just what missing means and how many people were actually missing when it comes to the story of the Great War.
Absolutely we do. And just the numbers you've quoted are almost too much to comprehend. These are men who are missing, who have no known grave, who are not named on their graves, who for various reasons their bodies could not be identified or perhaps could not be recovered in the context of the First World War. And that's essentially what missing in the terms of the First World War means. It means that simply you cannot be identified after you've died. It may be that a body has been recovered. It may be indeed be your body. They may be able to identify your unit, but they cannot personally identify you. It may also be that simply no body at all can be recovered. Perhaps you've been annihilated by artillery fire, or you've simply sunk so deep into the mud that you're gone forever. And I think that's incredibly powerful and really moving, because this isn't simply death or losing one's life in war. It's also carries a sense of potentially never being found, never having your death explained, never having your last moments understood. And even now in the 21st century, a much more secular age, I think that still carries a powerful weight. And in the context of the early 20th century, much more religious societies that were used to death, no doubt, but societies that were still very much anchored in Christian faith, to not be able to bury a loved one was a very, very troubling experience, as indeed it still is in the 21st century. But the religious context of the early 20th century is important to remember, especially in Britain, where no matter the poverty which you may have lived in, the idea that you would have a decent burial, defined by whatever could be afforded, was an incredibly powerful one. We only have to think of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, where one of Scrooge's greatest fears is that when he dies, he won't be given a proper burial. So that was a very powerful idea. But to be missing essentially means you are denied that privilege, that honour. And of course, this carries with it a great deal of grief, a great deal of suffering for the loved ones who remain behind. But essentially, it means you cannot be identified.
Yeah, and it's not just one or two people that this happens to. Of course, the numbers are enormous. And just to provide a little bit of context here, of around the million men, it's slightly higher, slightly lower, depending on whether you take Commonwealth servicemen into consideration. But let's take about roughly 1.1 million. Of those men to fall in British service throughout the Great War, 587,000 today have a name on a known grave. So those are men that are killed somewhere out in one of the theatres of war who have a known grave. On the other side of that, 526,000, so only slightly less, are named on memorials to the missing. 526,000 predominantly across the Western Front, but also including men lost at sea, which in many cases is all hands on a ship. What we also need to throw into this equation though, at the same time is that there are also 187,000 burials that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission accounts for, which are of unknown servicemen. So of that 526,000, 187,000, the bodies are known. So we've got the body, we've got the name. What we can't do in that scenario is match the two together. What that does leave, though, is a surplus of 338,000 who are unknown. Their whereabouts are quite literally unknown. So either still buried out in the fields today, again, lost at sea, various other possibilities. But that's over a third of a million people. British alone, bear in mind. The same numbers similar for the French, higher numbers for the Germans and Russians once again. These are staggeringly high numbers of men that are missing. And you've already touched on it, Spence, but I think it's really important to understand just why that happens. Because if you look in the Second World War, the proportion of missing is significantly lower. You look in the Peninsular War, at the time, the proportion of missing would have been significantly lower. I think there are two factors that play in my mind, at least, for this. One of them is the sheer ferocity of the fighting, particularly in no man's land. And second, I think perhaps more importantly, is the ability of not retaining the battlefield post-battle. In a very static environment like this, not holding the battlefield or the battlefield not moving on has a really big impact on the amount of fallen servicemen that can be accounted for.
This is very true. And one thing you've highlighted is the sheer violence of battle. The image of battle, the image of violence in battle, I still don't think we really understand just how violent a modern war could be. Yes, we now have films and television series that do not skimp on the violence of what happens to human bodies when they're exposed to high explosive shells or artillery, for example. But in the context of the First World War, where you have bombardments involving hundreds of thousands, millions of shells being fired in a relatively short period, human flesh and blood is simply blown away by this weight of metal, this weight of high explosive. And in perhaps the simplest way to go missing is quite simply you are vaporized. You are blown apart by a high explosive. There's nothing left of you to find, or at least it's scattered so much that you can't identify who's who. And I'm reminded of a quote you actually read in a previous episode about a man who was burying a comrade in a shoebox after he'd been killed by trench mortar fire. So there's that tremendous violence. That's the first and perhaps primary reason men go missing. But the other one is related to that, and that's the fact that this violence, this constant thunder of artillery completely reshapes the battlefield. It creates the moonscapes. It creates these huge areas of mud and slurry. And this is very, very difficult for bodies to endure in. They will sink into it. They'll disappear into it. If you've fallen, if you've died, if you've been killed by bullets, the artillery bombardment goes on. It may destroy your body once you're dead, or it may bury your body underneath this constant churn of mud. And that's something that affects all armies. You made a really good point about the need to retain the battlefield, because if you don't retain the battlefield, chances are, as the enemy advances over this, they won't do much to identify your bodies. Perhaps in the early part of the war, that's the case. In 1914, when there's still a certain amount of nobility, perhaps, in how the dead are treated, but very quickly that's lost, just due to the sheer numbers of men being killed almost immediately. And certainly by the latter stages of the war, when either the British or the French advance into the German trenches, or vice versa, the Germans advance, and they encounter the defenders, the dead defenders from this position, they will not spend that much time identifying them, especially if an advance is ongoing or a battle is ongoing. At best, they might actually be given a hasty burial in a mass grave. And sometimes those mass graves actually get uncovered from previous battles when people are digging trenches and so forth, and they accidentally dig through the site of a long-lost mass grave. There's also just a third point I'd add to this, and this is even if you're buried in the First World War, especially if you're buried in the earlier part of the First World War, 1914 and 15, to a lesser extent 16, quite often you're buried relatively close to the front line. And tragedy of the First World War for those burials is the fighting is at its most intense in certain sectors, such as Ypres. So if you're buried around Ypres in 1914, you'd be buried relatively close to the front line. And there's a really high risk that your grave will just be lost. In a bombardment, it'll be destroyed. The marker that had been placed there will be lost. Nobody knows where it is anymore. Or even if there's some movement on the battlefield, such as the Somme front, might be burials there, those cemeteries can be overrun. That actually happens in 1918, for example. There's a number of small British cemeteries, relatively small British cemeteries, in the area that the British are occupying. And when it's overrun by the Germans in March 1918, there's actually fighting around these areas, and the location of those graves are lost. So these are the key reasons why men go missing. And ultimately, Dan, it's all about the violence of the war and the scale of the war and the intensity of the war.
Yeah, and you made a good point there, actually, Spencer, particularly with relation to the early war. And what we need to remember, of course, is that in terms of identification discs, what we'd perhaps incorrectly call dog tags today, but are generally known by many as that, at the start of the war, in many instances, they don't exist. In others, they're private purchase only. The pre-war army will have either private purchase tags or a single metal disc. Now, that's useful in some senses, in if you find somebody fallen on the battlefield, particularly if it's somebody you don't know, so from a different company or a different battalion, what you could do is you could take that tag from their body, you could take it back to your platoon officer, and they would go through the ritual and the various stages involved in informing somebody that man had been killed. Now, the problem with taking that tag away from that body is you've then very often just removed the only identifying piece that's associated to that. And actually, one of the things that comes about, I think, you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, I think by about 1916 is this dual tag system. So the dog tags in inverted commas, if you like. And the idea is you get replicated information on two tags, and they're different shape as well. One's round and one's hexagonal. The idea being that if you find a body at night, you can feel by the shape which tag is which, and you then do exactly the same thing. You take one tag away, you take it back and give it to your platoon officer, but you leave the other tag with the body. And that, in many cases, retains the identification. And so this is a reaction, really, to the to the unfolding events on the battlefield, because in 1914, nobody's really thinking about how to look after these tremendous number of fallen on the battlefield. So there's definitely evolution in that sense. But I think one thing that we absolutely need to make clear at this point is that missing doesn't always mean dead. Today, we very much associate missing with dead. But one of the things we need to understand is there are more than 1 million men reported missing in the First World War. Ultimately, 526,000 are going to be recorded on a memorial to the missing, but many of those don't actually die. They go through the process of being reported missing in action, but there's a number of different things that you could become that doesn't necessarily mean that you die, Spence. There's a few different options.
And this is going to lead into, of course, that frustrating, agonizing in some ways, uncertainty for loved ones at home when news arrives that one of their loved ones is missing. As you rightly say, Dan, at the time, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're dead. There's actually a number of ways, particularly in the British Army, you can go missing. You may have been captured. That's probably the biggest explanation for why men are listed as missing. They've actually been captured, been taken away. They're heading off to Germany to be in prisoner of war camps. It might be simply that you've become separated from your unit. And we'll get into the actual process of how you're decided if you're missing in a moment. You might just not be there. And there's a whole host of reasons you might not be there. You could have been separated in battle, or on a lighter note, you might have been out drinking with your friends behind the lines. You might have had a bit of time off, and you've drunk too much and you're sleeping it off in a field somewhere. This does happen. You might be unwell and you're not able to attend roll call. That's a very short term one, but there are other ways that you can be listed missing. And as you say, a number of soldiers listed missing, but actually return back and are eventually found. Although sometimes they're not found or not identified, particularly if they're in German hands for some time. And I think that leads us quite interestingly into the process by which the British would identify the missing. And it has to be said, the French and the Germans use very similar systems as well, Dan.
Yeah, it does. And if you kind of think back to a situation, perhaps the evening of the 1st of July 1916, a kind of classic bad day on the Western Front that we've referred to so many times, but I think works well in this scenario. Let's imagine a battalion has gone over the top on that morning with 600 guys. Roll call comes at the end of that day with the survivors of that battalion, and you might have 500 that are missing. Now, and we see this if you look at war diaries. The casualty rates that we look at today, of course, are completely different because today, 100 years later, we know what happened to those men. We talk about people being missing when we think about casualty statistics today. Well, none of those are missing because we know exactly what's happened because they never turned up. But at the time, what you would have is, for example, the 1st Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers, who end up suffering something like 500 casualties on that opening day. They actually put down something like 400 men missing in action, perhaps only 50 or 60 known as killed in action. Now, there's a good reason for that, and that's because in order to be known as killed in action, you have to be witnessed by somebody falling and losing your life in battle. And more importantly, that person also has to live. And in many cases, it's those guys at the front of the line, nobody comes back. And so a soldier might have seen 4, 5, or 6 guys fall and know their fates. But if they themselves don't come back, all of that group of men are going to find themselves amongst the missing. And so, there is an obvious thing to look at with these kind of scenarios. Being missing in that context is a bit of a catch-all. And I'm just going to sidetrack slightly, Spence, because somebody said a minute ago, I think is by far the most underrated or underrepresented part of the story of the missing on the Western Front. And you just touched on it really briefly, but for me at least, it's the not knowing. We'll get into the process of just how next of kin are informed in a moment. But there's a finality to being killed in action. Tragically, so many are killed in action. The 1st of July 1916, for example. If you're one of those people gets a telegram back saying, your son, very sorry, regret to inform you, has been killed in action on this day. That's one thing. But in a way, that kind of grieving process can start on that day. What about those people who get, very sorry, your son has been reported missing in action? Because what that family is then faced with is day after day after day of looking out of the window as the postman walks down your road, wondering, is today going to be the day that they're going to give me that news? And I can just imagine the utter torture of them walking past every single day. It's a really, really powerful sentiment. And for me, and for many, this happens for years, not weeks, not months, but literally years. If you lose somebody at the Battle of Loos in 1915, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a mother that in 1919 still doesn't have some kind of hope that maybe the son might be one of the last prisoners of war to come home and somehow he's not managed to contact the family. Of course, in the vast majority of cases, that isn't the case at all, and those men have long since lost their lives. But for me, the whole idea and the power behind this word missing in the Great War is exactly that. It's the not knowing.
Completely agree. And something to bear in mind, of course, in the pre-First World War period, life and death is much more common to the European population than perhaps it is now. It's a sad fact that particularly if you're a working person, a working class in Britain, France, or Germany prior to the First World War, you will be experienced with death. Infant mortality is far higher than it is today. The average life expectancy is, depending on what particular area you're living in and what job you do, it's not much more than 50 years. Families live in big family groups in relatively small houses. And it's quite likely you will have seen some of your relatives die and you'll have buried them. And so, although death is still a frightening experience and a very emotional experience to witness, it's something that the population before the First World War is at least familiar with. And as you say, Dan, a really great point, there's a finality to death. The agony is there, but you can immediately begin the grieving process. And that's not to say the grieving process will be easy or short-lived or anything like that, but it allows that to begin. But to learn that your husband, your brother, your lover, your son is missing, it means that there is always that hope that they are in a German prison camp somewhere, that they will be returned to you some way or somehow. And that uncertainty, I think, inevitably humans lean in towards hope. It's both a strength and a weakness of the human psyche. And to know that your loved one is missing but might not be dead is you're always going to lean into the hope that they're going to return to you. And that image you've created about always looking towards the postman each day, is he going to bring news about where your son, husband, brother, father is, I think is just incredibly powerful. And that idea of that, they're missing, they may come back. I can't imagine the weight that would place psychologically on a family member. So I think that's what lends the idea of being missing in the First World War such emotional power. And of course, for those whose loved ones had, of course, gone, they would not be returning. They were dead. There was a long process that would unfold from this. But equally, it could be a long process if your loved one was actually alive in a German prison camp too.
That's true. And thank you for pointing me back on track from my diversion away from the original question you asked me, which of course was, what's the process like for those that reported action? So let's just take you back to that idea of the battalion that's gone over the top on the 1st of July. The evening of that day, there's going to be, I'd imagine, a fairly somber roll call in many battalions up and down the Western Front, with men either reporting at this point, yes, I'm here, or so-and-so is wounded, I saw him, he's behind the lines in a casualty clearing station or advanced dressing station, or on rarer occasions, so-and-so is killed, I saw them fall, they're definitely dead. And you start to get these kind of, these pockets that are filled, if you like, the casualty statistics, of course, of the time. Very often what we said is that number is going to be largely filled with missing, and for the reasons we've already explained. Now, as soon as that happens, you then have almost a chain of events that's going to trigger. The first thing that's going to happen is that next of kin are going to be informed that their loved one is reported either missing in action, occasionally immediately missing presumed killed, which is much less likely but does become a factor later on, or on occasion as well, wounded and missing, which you can imagine is probably an even worse fate, because you know that your loved one was in some kind of bad situation. And so, from that point onwards, things are gonna start ticking. So the British Army at this point is going to now start making inquiries, in effect, and there are units and administrative staff that are going to do exactly that. So one of the things to do is to check all of the casualty clearing stations, advanced dressing stations, various medical evacuation chain units to see if they can identify those men. Because bear in mind, some of these guys are going to be coming back unconscious. Some are going to be coming back missing body parts or kit and equipment, occasionally even identity discs. So it's not out of the question that you might have a man who's alive, unresponsive or unable to speak, but also without their identity being known. It's rare, but it can be done. So those inquiries are going to be made into that missing man. At the same time, inquiries are going to be made at their local platoon level. Did anybody see him? What was the last thing anybody saw? Trying to reconstruct those events. I should say this isn't a fairly informal way at this stage. This will be the platoon officer or the surviving NCO who's going to be making those inquiries. Following that, provided no news is sent back, whilst the family at home will have received a telegram, and I say a telegram in a kind of rounded way, because with officers it tends to be a telegram. The famous, we regret to inform you, with a few words explaining what the situation is. With other ranks, so privates up to company sergeant majors, what you're going to get is Army Form B104, which is, I think, rather callously a pre-printed letter. We regret to inform you, your loved one, insert name here, has been reported missing. No further particulars available at this time. You can imagine, for somebody who's just lost a loved one, that's really going to feel like quite a bitter blow. Of course, it's going to trigger no end of inquiries at home. Quite often, families are going to be really the driving force behind this. It's worth pointing out, Spence, actually, here, there is also, bearing in mind, the post, which no doubt we'll cover in a separate episode at some point, is very effective in the Great War. And quite often, if men have surviving comrades, one of the things that's really important, they really want to do, is to get their news home via letter before the official news, which is much more callous, comes home.
And this is something that is, in some ways, it's finding the humanity in an industrial war. Because if there's one thing that I think captures the administrative side of war, which is cold, efficient, and callous, it's that form B104. And you think about the hundreds of thousands of families in Britain who would receive that pretty dreadful form, hastily filled in. And it is cold and callous. It doesn't include details. And I think one thing that families desperately want to know more about is, how did my loved one die? And so this idea of a race to actually get the letters home, it's a very, very real one. If the man in question has surviving comrades, particularly if they can offer something about how this comrade died. And the one thing soldiers always do is tell each other about their families. And you read all the time about soldiers getting their comrades to promise to write home if they're killed or if they're wounded, or even if they're captured, if they're unable to contact their families, write home. And some of the letters that are written home, and some of them exist in archives, others may exist in family collections. Of course, there are hundreds of thousands of these letters. And sometimes some of the most touching are written by men who aren't natural wordsmiths, and they've written to a family member. Sometimes it's written in very thick pencil. There's idiosyncratic spelling, but they just want to let the family of their mate know what's happened to him. And quite often these men are trying to provide details, but also cushion the blow. You read repeatedly about he felt no pain. He would have died instantly, and he's always praised for these. But just the act of receiving those letters as well, although it's not as impersonal or as cold or callous as the B104 form, it's still just as heartbreaking. But it does provide some form of closure. And there's a sort of subsect to that letter as well. And this is letters back where sometimes, in fact, family members write to the front line, to people they know were their loved one's friend, saying, what's happened? Do you know, when did you last see him? And you get letters back saying, like, I saw him disappearing into the smoke and I don't know what happened to him. Or, the last I saw of him, he was running towards German machine gun nests. I've not seen him since. And that adds weight to it as well. And you've mentioned a standing joke now on this podcast. Would love to get into this in another episode. The Post, how efficient the Post is actually in the First World War. It's absolutely crucial to really the functioning of the army. And one of the reasons is, this is, of course, a pre-internet age. Telegrams are available, but they're very expensive. They're out of the reach of most families. But letters are comparatively cheap. And Britain, France, and Germany, all letter-writing societies. And so that constant communication with the front through the form of letter is important. But remember, listeners, there's always going to be a big time delay. There's going to be a big time lag there. So sitting at home waiting for news about your loved one, very, very difficult. And that's something I just keep coming back to, as you've made the point, Dan. What a strain on the emotions and the spirit of those left at home, just hoping for that news. And those letters home that I've seen from comrades explaining what's happened, sometimes they can be just as heartbreaking as the B104 forms as well.
Yeah, they can. I was thinking just then about, I remember reading a letter a while back, and it was about a soldier that had been killed in the front line. And there were two versions. One was sent to a brother who was in the military, and one was sent to the mother. And it was the same, talking about the same guy. It was the same information written on the same day. But those two letters were very, very different in nature. The one to the brother was really quite candid about what had happened. And I suspect because it's soldier to soldier, he's thinking he's going to see through anything I have to say here. The letter to the mother, to give you by way of example, said that he felt no pain, as you've mentioned there. Felt no pain. He died instantly by a rifle bullet to the stomach. Well, I don't think you need a medical degree to know that rifle bullets to the stomach are rarely going to be instantaneously fatal, and they're certainly going to be painful. But this is, in a way, one of the ways that comrades want to try and shield the blow. And of course, particularly when it comes to missing, quite often they just don't have any opportunity to do that, other than to say and really, really look at those bits that can give perhaps a crumb of pride, if not a crumb of hope, is to say, he did his duty to the last. I saw him advancing gallantly, all of this kind of thing, to really, make that terrible experience at least one of some pride, if that makes sense. But, since we're mentioning letters, I think there's another important step in this, and rather unusual one in this process of searching for a missing man that happens in this process. And that's a very important organization this is at the time, and much overlooked, I should say, is the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, they're based in Geneva in Switzerland, typically neutral country, and the ICRC have a typically neutral stance. They're in effect the go-betweens between the German army, the French army, the Russian army, the British army, And they're going to become the central hub for any communications and any inquiries that are made regarding missing men. So lists are provided and published and sent and forwarded on to different individuals, all through this ICRC hub. And the idea is that the Germans will say, look, we're missing these guys. The Brits will say, we're missing these guys. And the ICRC will pass that on and say, have you got any of these men? Or can you provide us your latest POW returns? That way, a number of men, there is, of course, a delay, as you rightly say, but a number of people are ultimately identified as being taken prisoner. In fact, the total number, just taking the British, total number of prisoners taken is about 183,000 in the Great War. And almost to a man, those 183,000 are going to be reported missing. Fortunately, the families, maybe weeks, maybe days, maybe months, possibly even years later, will eventually find out that their loved one is alive. Doesn't mean they'll come home. There are several things that are going to play a factor in that. The Spanish flu is really, really quite brutal, particularly to malnourished prisoners. But they are alive at that time. And at least for some, that period of awful uncertainty can be over. For many more, of course, it never ends. Certain famous characters, and I think we can't really talk about the missing Spence without mentioning one in particular. His name is John Kipling. This is, of course, the only son of the author Rudyard Kipling, who goes missing on the third day of the Battle of Loos in 1915. Now, Rudyard has really pulled strings to get John, who by no stretch should have been in the army. His eyesight was absolutely terrible. He shouldn't have been in the army, but being a young, impressionable lad at the time, he was desperate to go. And his dad, I think perhaps thinking he was doing the right thing, managed to pull some strings with some influential mates and get him a commission into the Irish Guards. John then goes missing on the third day of the Battle of Loos, around an area known as Chalk Pit Wood. And I think, although his story is very famous, it's emblematic, I think, of many more missing men of the Western Front. Except the Kiplings have one major advantage, and that's that they've got the means to really search. And the same influential friends that Rudyard Kipling is going to be calling on to get his son into the army are exactly the same things that Rudyard and his wife Carrie are now trying to find out what happened to him. They're going to be writing to field marshals and generals and the Kaiser in Germany to say, my son is missing, what can you do? He writes to the President of the United States to try and bear pressure to find out what's happened to John. The real tragedy for me on this one is, Private Smith in the same battalion, his parents didn't have a hope in hell of doing any of that.
No, and some subjects that are definitely worthy of covering in the future. The interactions between people searching for the missing and casualty clearance, and trying to identify the bodies even after the war is a huge subject. And that point you've just made about it's not created equally. If you, as you say, if it's Mr. and Mrs. Smith wondering what's happened to their son, they don't have those kind of resources. I'm reminded of another missing of the First World War, Brigadier General Charles Fitzclarence, VC, who's the highest ranked officer on the Menin Gate, commemorating those with no known grave. He's actually been buried in 1914, but it was a hasty burial, and the location of his grave is subsequently lost in the fighting, and it's just gone, it's never found. He's actually married to one of Winston Churchill's cousins, and his wife, or his widow, I should say, after the war, in Charles Fitzclarence's papers such as they are, that you find all this correspondence where she was writing to just about everybody she could find, saying, what happened to my husband? Where was he last buried? She writes to Winston Churchill, she's related to him. And the tragedy for that is people do actually write back to her and say, well, he was buried here, but there's been several huge battles fought over this ground. You're just not going to find where he's buried. And she continues the search for him way into the late 1920s before she finally accepts that he's gone. So those are interesting examples. But what I do think they exemplify is the grief that Rudyard Kipling's desperate to find out what happened to his son. Charles Fitzclarence's widow is desperate to find out where he's buried. And then amplify and multiply that by the hundreds of thousands who don't have that recourse, who can't write to the President of the United States, who can't write to Winston Churchill. And you can imagine the pressure that must have affected families. And indeed, it can cause families to break apart. That lasting pressure can have very, very severe effects upon relationships within the family afterwards. And Of course, if just taking it a step back, if having learned that your loved one is missing, having inquired with the International Red Cross and not received a response that your loved one is in German hands, then the next step is ultimately after six months, there's no further news, then you are listed, or your loved one is listed as presumed dead on the last day seen alive.
Whilst we were talking about that aspect of finality, and whilst administratively there is an aspect of finality to that, that person is no longer considered to be amongst the living. I don't know for a family member whether that would hold any sway whatsoever. It's an administrative death. It's not a confirmation of anything. In fact, there are relatively few, in fact, very few instances where men who have been listed as presumed dead for a while are then found to be alive. And even though there are very few instances of this, they are unsurprisingly very well covered. And they really get around in the media. And I think all that's going to serve to do for the vast majority who are never going to have that experience, that's just going to increase the idea of hope. Somebody was found a year after they've been missing, maybe that's going to be our story. Of course, the vast majority of the time, it never is. But as you say, Spencer, it's one of those stories where at the 6 month point, give or take, not always, but at the 6 month point, as long as no further news is forthcoming, that person is going to be officially announced as presumed killed. And from the administrative point, there's a couple of, I think, really sad elements to come into this. One of them, which I think it comes across as callous. You can understand to an extent why it happens, but it certainly doesn't. It's not a good look. And that's quite literally that a soldier's pay is stopped. But the soldier's pay is stopped from the point, 4 weeks from the point that they were last seen alive. So they're given a 4-week addition in pay. But if you've been receiving that pay for 6 months with them presumed missing, 5 months of that has got to go back, and they'll deduct that out of your dead loved one's money. It just does not ring well at all, that one. But that's the reality, from an administrative point of view. And then for those parents and wives and kids, there's a whole process of, if you like, administration that needs to go on from that point. That can then start looking at things like wills, and the wife has got to get a widow's pension, or the mother. And imagine these poor families that have got more than one loved one that are killed in the Great War, going through this process time and time again. Absolutely horrific. So, there's the very personal when it comes to the story of being missing, and then there's the very impersonal that's associated to it. Those two things have a weird juxtaposition for me. And, it's worth pointing out, we're talking about this from a British perspective, but the same thing applies whether you're Australian, Indian, American, German, or French. In many cases, the story is just as awful. And it really does. It spreads across the entire Great War. But let's stick with those at this point who may officially be presumed dead now. Of course, some of them will come back, but those vast majority are never going to be found again. Or I say never found again because it's interesting. Some are found in the years and months later, but let's just look at the idea briefly of commemoration of those individuals, though, because that's one. For one, it was a huge problem in post-war society. How do you commemorate somebody whose body you don't have? And this was a big question that nobody had really had to answer before, at least on this scale.
And this goes back to a point I made at the head of the podcast about the nature of mourning the dead in Western European society in the early 20th century was absolutely anchored on the dead having a place which you could go and you could pay tribute to them, even if it was just a pauper's grave or a garden of remembrance. Having that anchoring effect of your loved ones being somewhere that you could visit and being given a proper send-off was huge. And both the funeral and then subsequently visiting their place of rest became a focus for remembrance, and it had been really since the later part of the Victorian era, when cemeteries began to take on more and more working class people. And so not having the complete finality of knowing that your loved one is dead, if they are presumed dead, they haven't been seen for 6 months, none of their comrades can answer this. How do you mourn this death? And this is a cultural problem that has simply never occurred before in European history. Yes, people have gone missing in Europe prior to this time through accidents or incidents, but to suddenly have hundreds of thousands of people who are dead but are missing and have no focus for remembrance, nowhere for grieving mothers, fathers, wives, sons, daughters to mourn them, is such a psychological shock. It never happened in European culture, in living memory. And really, you'd have to go back centuries for this to find that something comparable. And how to deal with this is a genuine problem, and it poses questions for the authorities. How do we commemorate these hundreds of thousands of people who don't have a grave, who don't have anywhere for their family to go, don't have a center for mourning and for remembrance? And that's the key thing. How do the grieving loved ones mourn somebody who just isn't there at all, and you can't even go and pay tribute at their last resting place or their last known location? I have to say that from that human tragedy, and it is a human tragedy, emerges actually some of the most striking and memorable and enduring memorializations of the Great War, and perhaps none more famous than the Unknown Warrior, which, of course, we're famous in the United Kingdom for having, but other nations also have tombs of the Unknown Warrior too. And I think this centers a lot of that memorialization for those who are missing, who have fallen, but whose names we can never know. And the selection of the Unknown Warrior, of course, is itself a subject for debate when it's first proposed.
It is, and the Unknown Warrior, as you rightly say, is an absolutely stunning piece of memorialization. It's actually suggested by a padre who's served out on the Western Front, a man by the name of David Railton, and he comes up with the idea. He actually sees a lot of these wounded and dying men, and he realizes that many families are going to have nowhere to go and commemorate their loved one at the end of the Great War. And so he comes up with the idea of having one man to represent all of those who have fallen and remain unidentified in the Great War. And his proposal, I think, is a very striking one, because what he wants to do is to take somebody who is utterly unidentifiable. So he doesn't want to take somebody from the Battle of Mons, because that could only be a 1914 man. He doesn't want to take somebody only from a 1918 battle. He wants to make sure that whoever this person is, he cannot be known. Because what that does is it doesn't exclude anybody whose life was lost in the Great War. Every mother who went to visit this grave had at least the chance that she could be looking at her son, that it could be her son who's the Unknown Warrior. And so what happens, it's actually, again, one of those, Spence, we're going to have to come back and cover this another day. But one of those things that happens is that a number of graves are actually selected in total secrecy from different parts of the major battlefields that British troops are involved in the Great War. And they're brought into a single room, and a brigadier general is given the job of selecting in secret, without knowing any details about them, one of the coffins of those unidentified soldiers. That man becomes the Unknown Warrior. His body is taken back and is laid in state at Westminster Abbey and buried there, and of course remains there, one of the most popularly visited graves in the UK to this day. And the idea when and I have to get the date right, I think it's 1920, possibly 1921, when the grave or the tomb of the Unknown Warrior is unveiled. Anybody can go there who's got a missing one, and they can have a moment of reflection with somebody that represents their missing loved one. I don't have it to hand, but I remember something that was really striking was a letter that was found the night after the burial. And it was found at the foot of the grave. And I don't have the words. I don't even think I could get through them if I had them with me right now. But it starts off, "Dear boy, I've found you at last." It's an incredibly powerful bit of history. But it goes to show that for many, this is exactly one of those things for those people that have just been, let's get it right, absolutely desperate for any news, any sense of closure. And what a powerful sentiment. No surprise it's spread to other nations as well.
And that point you've just made about the letter, I'm really glad you brought it up, because as well as the letter, there's also some correspondence that appears in national newspapers afterwards. And what's striking about this is these are letters from all walks of life, from fathers, from mothers, from brothers, from sisters, from loved ones, from sons and daughters. And the idea that the unknown warrior, the unknown soldier, represents their loved one is an extremely powerful one, and it allows those mourning the missing to center their remembrance, their pilgrimage, if you will, on a location to say, well, that's actually my son, that's my husband, that's my father buried there. And that is there's such a powerful outpouring in the British press after this. It's so widely accepted. It's so widely praised. It clearly meant a great deal to those loved ones who did have a missing soldier. And one thing, a personal bugbear, has become a little bit fashionable, I think, in certain literary circles to dismiss the power of the unknown warrior and to look down on it a little bit. There was some comment on those grounds during the centenary period. And I think that just completely ignores the actual history of it, that the reaction to it at the time was overwhelmingly positive. Yes, there was criticism of it too. There was criticism of how it was done. There was criticism about whether it should have been done. But they were drowned out because ultimately it wasn't about the critics. It was about those who had a missing loved one and now finally had a place with which they could pay tribute to what could be their son, their boy, their father, their husband. And that's something that was inconceivable, really, before the First World War in Britain, but now would become such a focus of commemoration and memorialization. And beyond the unknown warrior, it would also expand to the stunning memorials we've mentioned several times now, Meningate at Ypres and Thiepval down on the Somme.
It would indeed. And just one final thing for anybody that's ever gets the opportunity to go to Westminster Abbey in London and visit the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, one of the things that very few people do, and I always like to point it out when I'm there, so I'll point it out to you guys listening in now. When you are there, look up, because the flag that is directly above the grave, the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, is the very same Union flag that David Rowton, that Padre on the Somme, uses to cover the bodies of fallen soldiers as he's coming up with this concept. So directly above you is the history of really where this concept comes from. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Spence, because the same concept that really gets exported back to the UK and, of course, ultimately to Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, the idea of an unknown warrior, the same questions really being asked on the battlefields of the Western Front. And this really brings us to the idea of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, or the Imperial War Graves Commission, as it's called at the time. Now, this body is set up to commemorate all of those that are lost on the Western Front. And again, we'll come back to it another day, but the general idea, the conversation that's had here is, are we bringing all the boys home? Does everybody get to come home? And if so, how are we going to do it? Now, very early in the war, whilst the war's still going on, Fabian Ware, the man that really founds this commission at the time, realizes there is no way in hell everybody's coming home. Simply, there are far too many missing. And so the decision is made, if we can't bring them all home, nobody's coming home. Which is a really big controversial decision at the time. That being said, I like it today, and I think history has proved us right on this, that it was the right decision to be made. Interestingly, the French will repatriate to home villages, but then again, remember, they're fighting on home territory. The Americans, though, do repatriate. They offer a one-time opportunity to repatriate their fallen. So about a little under half of the men who fall on the Western Front in the Great War, from the AEF's perspective, are still buried out on the Western Front. More than half have actually been repatriated back to the UK. The Brits do not offer that. The Brits say, we can't bring them all home, so we're not bringing any of them home. This is a really big deal, particularly with wealthy families in 1914 who have got the money to privately bring their loved one home, and the government says, nope, not doing it. I like it. I think it's the right choice. They also, of course, are faced with the problem, well, what do we do about commemorating those guys who have no grave at all? And this is that 520-odd thousand men. Big, big numbers. And what they ultimately decide is that everybody is commemorated, but they're only ever going to be commemorated in one place. So one of two things happens. You have a headstone with a name on it, or you're on a memorial to the missing. And the memorials to the missing that spring up, in effect, if you can imagine going north to south through the British parts of the battlefield, depending on where you were last seen, depending on which fight you were missing in, you'll find yourself on a memorial in that region to the missing. So if you almost go north to south, I'm doing it from memory here, so no doubt I'll miss some. But in the northern part of the battlefield, so in the Ypres salient where you're lost, If you're lost really up until about September of 1917, your name is going to appear on the Menin Gate. If you're lost after September 1917, your name will appear on the Tyne Cot Memorial to the Missing. Slightly further south of that, you'll end up on the Plugstert or the Plug Street Memorial. Slightly further down in the 1915 battlefields we've covered of Loos and Festa Bay, you'll either be on the Loos Memorial to the Missing or slightly higher up, the Le Torre Memorial to the Missing. And so on and so forth until you reach places like the Arras Memorial to the Missing, and then finally beyond that, the Somme and the famous Thiepval Memorial, those 72,000 names on it. There are more than a dozen, there are perhaps around 20 of these different memorials that will commemorate an individual. And every one of those shares the same fate, of course. None of them have been identified. Well, I say that, there are a few exceptions, and we'll maybe come back to that in a moment. But just to give an idea of the power of this and how important it is, I'm just going to mentally take you back up north to the Menin Gate here, which is finally opened on the 8th of August 1927. And it's going to be a man by the name of Herbert Plumer, who we've featured a couple of times. Plumer of Messines, a really highly regarded general of the Great War. He is going to be invited to unveil the memorial. Bear in mind, up until this point, all of those families, other families have a loved one's grave they can visit. The 55,000 families on the Menin Gate do not have a loved one that they can visit. They've got nowhere to go and pay their respects to whoever it was in their family that fell at that time. So they're left in a kind of limbo. And Plumer's aware of this. And when the Menin Gate is opened, it's attended by something like 6,000 or 7,000 families. These are the families of men who are named on that memorial. Now, it's powerful enough going 100 years later as a great-great-grandson or a great-great-nephew of somebody on that memorial. Imagine in the 1920s when it's the mum, the sister, and the children that are going. This is very powerful. And one thing that Plumer says that sticks in my mind, and whenever I'm at the Menin Gate, I love to tell the story because it's just so powerful. You can feel the emotion in what he says. He, as any good general does, he kind of blunders on for about 8 minutes where he's talking to everybody and people are thinking, what's this general going on about? And he doesn't really get much point across until he gets to the very last sentence. And what he says is really striking. And he looks around the crowd and he says to the family, from this day forward, they are no longer missing. They are here. Very powerful sentiment. And I think it sums up exactly what a memorial to the missing means.
What a powerful statement that's still repeated to this day. And also it gives that an air of finality, which we keep coming back to, that the tragedy of being a family member or having a family member who is missing is the uncertainty, the hope, the dreams that they may be found safely. And now to have this and to have a location to visit beyond, of course, the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, you can now go to the Menin Gate in the late 20s and see potentially your loved one's name engraved on the wall. Even if you don't know where he's buried, there's a name there that you can pay tribute to. And that finality, they are here, is just an incredible statement. And Plumer of Messines is not known really as a speech maker. These comments about him droning on were well placed. But that what an incredible statement, which apparently he coined himself. He didn't actually have that written for him. And as a man who commanded, of course, Second Army that had fought almost the entire war on the Ypres front, apart from a brief sojourn in Italy, he knew better than any about what that meant to the men of his army. And so a really powerful comment. And I would say, mainly because of its geographic location, it's easier to get to Ypres than it is down to the Somme from Great Britain. The Menin Gate is still an incredible centre of remembrance, of course, famous for its last post ceremony. I'd love to get into a full episode just talking about the construction of the Menin Gate and the construction of Thiepval. Again, chalk that one down to a future episode. But it's a fitting tribute, both Menin Gate and Thiepval and the other memorials that you've mentioned, to those who do not have a known grave. But of course, it doesn't mean, even if you weren't identified during the war, even if your fate was undetermined during the war. We've talked a little bit about Rudyard Kipling and Charles Fitzclarence's widow making all efforts to find their loved ones. But the process of trying to find and identify remains begins almost as soon as the guns fall silent on the Western Front. And it continues, in fact, to this very day.
It does, and this is really the legacy of the Great War. And I've got a little bit of personal history with regards to this. I maybe share in a moment, but the idea, of course, is that when the guns fall silent on the 11th of November 1918, there's one almighty mess left behind, and really whole swathes of the Western Front have been utterly churned up and smashed to pieces for years and years and years. And of course, one of the things that needs to happen is that area needs to be salvaged and reclaimed and returned to something usable. And a big part of that process is quite simply clearing the bodies and identifying those bodies. And one of the things that comes about very quickly, and it's often, by the way, former frontline soldiers that are going to volunteer and take part in this, is you get the engagement of people known as graves registration units. In effect, what's going to happen is teams of people are going to use the famous grid map system of trench mapping of the Great War. They're going to go through and they're going to scour each patch of land individually, yard by yard, individual men with a stick trying to find bits of disturbed ground that may hold the body of a fallen soldier. And if they're to find one, they're then going to try and identify those individuals. I can imagine at the end of a war like that, crossing over, in early 1919, crossing the Passchendaele battlefield of nearly 2 years before. I can't think of anything more disastrous or more horrific than having to do that, particularly if you'd been a combatant, one of those guys that had fought there before. There are multiple horrific stories of this kind of environment. But at the same time, there's a real desire of these guys to do the right thing by the lads, by their former comrades. And so there is a desire to actually identify them. The reality, though, as we've seen from the numbers, is that in many cases, 2, 3, 4 years later, there's very little that can be done. Of course, today, there are different sets of tools at our disposal. Maybe we'll touch on that in a moment. But the general idea at the time is if a body is recovered, and it's as simple and tragic as somebody going along, finding a patch of ground that looks disturbed, looks like perhaps it's maybe been a field burial, or there might be a bit of material or bone or boot sticking out of the ground, is to really stick a spiked stick or a metal cane into the ground, pull it out, and then try and smell for human decay. It's as crude as that in many instances. If that does happen, that location gets marked, and then a team are then going to exhume that body, examine their artifacts, their kit and equipment, see if you can find buttons or letters or anything that can tell you, which nationality they are, perhaps which branch of service, which battalion. If you're lucky, you might find a metal shoulder title. And then if you find a pocket or a soldier's paybook or even an identity disc, you may be able to get a name for some of those guys. And if we think about the 170 odd thousand soldiers who are today buried in Commonwealth war grave cemeteries as an unknown soldier, the vast majority of those are going to be those men that are identified post-war. So they're found in 1919, 1920, 1921. In some instances, if you walk through a British cemetery, and the same is true in other nationalities, you may find an unknown soldier written on a headstone. That means quite literally the GRU or whoever's discovered them knows nothing other than they're an unknown soldier, doesn't even know their nationality. In some cases, you might find an unknown corporal of the Gordon Highlanders. Well, you can almost read the story from that. You can tell that at some point, some piece of kit has been found that identifies that soldier as a member of the Gordon Highlanders. So it might be a piece of particular tartan. It might be a cap badge that shows the Gordon's crest. It could be any item. And of course, with a corporal, we know at least part of their rank insignia has been found as well. And typically, the more information that can be found, along with the context of where they're found and the time period they might be found, gives you a much higher chance of identifying that individual. Now, it's not an easy thing to do, even today. I can tell you from previous experience in 2015, I was involved in an archaeological dig at the Hohenzollern Redoubt in Luce, and the team I was with at the time, we found the body of a soldier of the Leicestershire Regiment who'd fallen 100 years before. Now, of course, it's only skeletal remains at that time, but a couple of the items did survive. So his shoulder badge, which told us that he was a member of the Leicestershire Regiment, and a few other clues, like the fact he was carrying 2 specific types of gas mask. The little plastic strip from the original smoke helmet could still be seen, as could the glass eyelets from the PH hood. That told us that he was carrying 2 types of gas mask, attacking the Hohenzollern Redoubt with the Leicestershire Regiment, And we could actually triangulate that down to a very specific position. We actually got it down to the exact day. But there were 22 private soldiers in that battalion lost on that day. And of course, we can never get those details just right. And the same thing happened in the post-war years, Spence. It's the story of the Great Wars is always, and I think will continue to be evolving, which in some ways is really one of the most fascinating things about it.
Really is. And it's about how the First World War not only reshaped the map of Europe, reshaped it culturally, it's the legacy it left on the land. And this is of another subject I'd love to get into. We're probably familiar with the Iron Harvest. Many listeners will be familiar with it. There's a concept that you can see around about harvest time in Belgium and in parts of France, where farmers will just churn up so much metal, primarily from the First World War, perhaps some from the Second, depending on whereabouts you are, and just leave it out for disposal. But along with that, there's also sometimes there's bodies are unearthed. And one thing that I think is not necessarily comforting, that's not quite the right word, but it's something to be respectful of, is the fact that even now when bodies are found, and you've just described very well the finding of that man from 1915, when bodies are found, there is still, whether they are American, French, German, British, Australian, Canadian, or Belgian, there's still a process which can be undertaken to try and identify these men. And of course, we now have the benefits of technology that just didn't exist in the 1920s. That even goes so far as using DNA to try and identify surviving relatives and so forth, if it can be narrowed down to that stage. And what is fascinating to me is that these efforts are still being made long after the First World War passed completely from living memory. And I think that speaks to the overwhelming power of the idea of the missing. And we see it in the memorials we keep mentioning. And even though we as a generation don't have that direct link anymore, we may have family links, of course, but we don't have that in our living memory anymore, we still respect what this means. It carries a certain weight to say they were missing. And the efforts that are put into trying to identify them, and then the ceremony with which soldiers, whether they're identified or not, will be buried, I think speaks to just how important commemoration of the First World War remains more than a century on.
Yeah, and as far as commemoration goes, I'll bring it back, I think, perhaps to round off with the fact that, to my mind, whereas we talk at pretty much every episode we've covered, the focus has been on the individual when it comes to the soldiers. We've talked about their experiences in the front lines, talked about what it was like to be in the fight. I think this is the first episode that really, whilst the focus is the individual, the impact is really the legacy and the family. And, the story of the missing, I think, really isn't a story of the individual rather than a story of those people that are left behind with that uncertainty. I just, there was something I wanted to try and segue into and find a reason to tell this story to you, because it's one that's stuck in my mind since I started in 2015, looking at this subject, particularly with a focus on my county of Hertfordshire. Do you know what, Spence? I don't think I need a segue. I think I'm just going to tell you a story which I find interesting and hope other people do too. It's a guy called Percy Buck who in 1917 goes over the top on the 31st of July, so the opening day of the Third Battle of Ypres. And his experience, as far as we know, from a man next to him at the time by the name of Private Ramsell, he says that Percy, when he goes over the top, just before, he takes out a photo of his wife, Bertha, and his son, Cyril, who's 2 years old. And he shows it to Private Ramsell and says, this is my wife and boy. He turns it over and he says he's written on the back, whoever finds this, please return to my family. Puts it in his pocket and he goes over the top that day and he disappears up into no man's land and he's never seen again. A few days later, Mrs. Buck is going to get exactly what we've discussed throughout this episode. She's going to get that awful telegram back. Your husband has been reported missing in action. It was, I remember the street number. It's number 57 Balliol Road in Hitchin. And she is going to be faced with that, as we said at the start, pretty tortuous daily experience of wondering if any news is going to come. She goes on with like that for about 4 months. And 4 months later, much to her surprise, a letter drops through the letterbox of her house, and it's postmarked Geneva. And it's a letter, as she opens it up, it's actually it's an original document It's a translated letter that's been typed. I actually have it. And it says, in effect, I would like to return this postcard to a grieving wife. And it goes on to explain that the finder was asked to send it back to the family. And the man talking about it says, I found the dying comrade in no man's land. He had this letter in his hand, and I found out later on the reverse, it was asked to return it to his wife. And this I'm happy to do. And he's actually sent it back via Switzerland. The reason he sent it back via Switzerland is that man's name was Gefreiter Joseph Wilczek. He was a German soldier who had actually found a mortally wounded or perhaps even deceased Private Percy Buck in no man's land. And he'd taken it upon himself to take this card back to his trench, get it translated, sent home to his family in Germany, who then sent it home, who then sent it on to Switzerland, who then sent it on to Mrs. Buck, so that 3 months later, that horrific experience of being unknowing of what had happened to a loved one could finally come to an end for her. And because of that moment of humanity on behalf of an enemy soldier, in effect, that had taken away this moment of misery for Mrs. Buck. And she commented on this to her son Cyril when he was older. And he told his daughter Christina, who I'm very proud to know. But it's just one example, but it's one that has always stuck in my mind as a moment where, you know, in the kind of horror of the Great War, sometimes little moments of humanity can triumph. And to the backdrop of this, perhaps the worst of all experiences of being on the receiving end of a missing in action telegram, you know, it's something that we shouldn't forget. And me, for one, I don't think I'll ever forget that particular experience.
A really powerful intervention on this podcast. And I think one thing that's really comes out in this particular discussion is the personal element of this. And I hope, listeners, we've really got that across to you, that when we see these names, thousands of names on the memorials, when we see those tombstones, headstones, I should say, in Commonwealth War Graves cemeteries, which just says a soldier known unto God, these were all somebody's loved ones. They were all somebody's son. They were all somebody's child. And that is something I think to remember as we reflect on what the Great War means and what it meant for the people at the time. And it's easy in the scale of the Great War, with its tremendous casualties, with the sheer violence of it, the sheer loss of it, to forget that each life is an individual one. Each person involved in this war is a person with their own hopes, dreams, aspirations, strengths and weaknesses. And so the missing, I think, are a fascinating and a tragic story, sub-story, if you will, to the sacrifice of the First World War. But one thing I think we can say is, if we were to go back to the 1920s or 1930s in a time machine, and we were to meet grieving families, worrying about their missing, worried about their lost loved ones, I think that they would draw some comfort at least, from the fact that even a century on, the fact that we're on this podcast discussing this now, the fact that thousands of people each year are at those, the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, are at Menin Gate, are at Tietval, are at other places, remembering the fallen, I think is tribute to the fact that their names have not been forgotten.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.